This episode is brought to you by Dwagon's Discount Herbalism Supplies. Need a tangleroot tick turn without emptying the coin purse? Perhaps a potion of health too steep for your heap? Try one of our bloodgrass health potions, quarter the price for half the effect. That's double your money.
Hi, I'm Feldor Dwagon, founder of Dwagon's Discount Herbalism Supplies. I work tirelessly to bring you the cheapest herbalism and medical supplies this side of the Bleeding Sun Chasm. We don't gild our products to artificially raise our prices. And we use recycled potion bottles, expertly cleaned and reused. Our products may all look different, but their effects are guaranteed. Our ingredients are collected directly from gatherers in the region. No middle dwarves here. That is how Dwagon's Discount Herbalism Supplies keeps our prices low, low, low.
So come on down to Dwagon's Discount Herbalism Supplies today. I'm guilty of giving herbalism barely a second thought in some of my games. If you're like me, you tend to be driven by what your players are interested in. So if a player is focused on crafting, then I'll research and prepare details on crafting. If they're all about collecting arcane knowledge, then I'll make sure I throw in some of those details. But herbalism is one of those areas that we could develop a lot of information and world building around, but it can be overlooked as we juggle plots, grand magic, and chaotically good players. So in this video, I'm going to talk about herbalism, what it is, and how you can use it to inform your world building. In a recent game, my cash-strapped players wanted to buy something to help heal, but they had no money. 50 gold, after all, is a huge amount of money for new characters for a one-off health potion. So I gave them a healing rag, their name for it, not mine. It was fabric that had been soaked in healing herbs and could be applied to a wound to restore 1 hit point. I charged them 5 gold for each one. This was done off the cuff, but in the future, I might apply a lot more rigor around what this item is, how it's formed, and how it's used. It's weird when you think about it, isn't it? So many storylines and plots revolve around seeking out a magical plant or herb to cure some sort of poison, but yet we rarely use that same way of thinking in how items are actually created. So in this episode, let's delve into herbalism, add some principles that we can use, and build it out. First things first, as always, let's define what herbalism is. It's a science that studies and processes plants for health purposes. In a fantasy world, herbalism could be used for more magical purposes, such as warding against evil spirits. You can contradict herbalism with alchemy by defining the purpose of alchemy as to transmute elements from one to another. An alchemist may use plants for alchemy, but they are not limited by it. An alchemist may also be attempting to transmute one substance into another, the classic being lead to gold, whereas a herbalist would be less interested. Herbalism uses a number of methods to refine plants to change their effects on living things. This includes increasing or modifying the effect. The method that is most recognizable is boiling it. Imagine a lone witch in a dark forest, her wooden cabin with a trail of smoke out of the chimney. Inside, a bubbling cauldron over a fire, while a crooked and gnarled hand drops leaves and mushrooms into a mixture.
Mushroom and spinach risotto will be done shortly.
Well, I guess she also could be making a potion. So let's do a quick run through of some of the methods herbalists may use. Rather than simply listing them, I'm going to explain it as I would as a game master. The party approaches a herbalist shop, a short, squat building with vines growing along the side of the building and large, slightly wild bushes of lavender surrounding the entrance. Placed out into the street are 2 large drying tables, tilted towards the sun, rows of mushrooms and flowers, some with small lengths of wood weighing them against the breeze. So here we have our first method, drying. Drying is often used to preserve items, but can also be used as the first step in processing. Tea leaves are dried, with black tea dried for longer than green. Both are then steeped or submerged into hot water. Steep does not always mean hot water, but it often is. Back to our scene. Pushing past the wayward lavender branches, you enter the shop, instantly assaulted by smells of dry herbs and a crackling wood fire. A cauldron is bubbling over a small fire, with neat piles of ingredients laid out on a nearby table. The herbalist, a young half-elf with short blonde hair, small glasses, and a neat shirt and vest, is grinding with a mortar and pestle. Behind him are dozens of bottles with liquids, some of which have candles underneath them, causing to bubble up and drip through finely crafted glass beakers into other bottles. Come in, mind the cauldron, it bubbles occasionally. So we have 3 more preparation methods. In the cauldron, the herbalist is brewing different ingredients together. This is a classic witch's brew, joining different ingredients and mixing them together using heat. If the cauldron is left boiling to reduce the liquid, it becomes a decoction, or a concentrate. This method is often used for much tougher materials like bark and roots. The next is crushing dried items in a mortar and pestle. This is used to create a powder, which can then be mixed with a liquid to make potion, mixed with a paste to make balm, or steeped like tea. Powder could also be mixed with something to hold its shape, to make a pill. The last is distillation. By boiling the liquid and allowing it to condense into another bottle, it highly concentrates the mixture. This is how high percentage alcohols are made, though the machine is often shortened from distillery to still. Classic example of how distillation may be used in games is with health potions. It could be the high potency healing potions in D&D are made not with different ingredients, but rather are just distilled more. A herbalist could take 2 healing potions, each which do 2d4 plus 2 healing, and distill them into one that does 4d4 plus 4 healing. Instead of charging 100 gold for 2 healing potions, they can now charge 150 gold for a greater healing potion. If you distill 2 greater healing potions into a superior healing potion, instead of 300 gold for 250 gold healing potions, they can instead sell it for 450 gold. Of course, the prohibitive gold cost and length of time used to create these would lead herbalists to stock more at the lower end. If you watch my last video, I showed you a creeping plant with red stems that I called bloodgrass that could be made into a bloodgrass healing potion. The bloodgrass healing potion is a much cheaper, much more rustic version of a healing potion. It has thick, red liquid with a coppery aftertaste. When consumed, it provides 1d4 plus 1 healing. You could have a herbalist selling that for 15 gold, while, behind them, they're distilling more to make standard healing potions. There are of course many other methods a herbalist may use. They may crush and strain plants, or carefully harvest the sap. They might chew on leaves to combine it with their spit. Maybe they leave it in oil for days, weeks, or even years. A herbalist might place things into sealed containers to simply be next to each other. I once bought a small piece of truffle and left it in a sealed container with some eggs. The flavor of the truffle was able to permeate the eggshells, giving it a very mild truffle taste. If the players came across an old herbalist, they might sell century quail eggs that had been left for months, surrounded by herbs, ash, and quicklime. The resulting eggs grant minor healing and have quite the strong taste. So I'm just going to back over exactly the different methods I mentioned. So we talked about dried whole, such as mushrooms, flowers, or leaves, dried shredded, such as teas, herbal concoctions, or powdered, which can be poured into liquids or food, burnt, or even thrown. Classic D&D items like this include the dust of disappearance, dust of sneezing and choking, and dust of dryness. Liquids that can be consumed, such as brews, distillates, or decoctions. These include things like the potion of invisibility, potion of health, and potion of resistance. We have pills, which are powders combined with something to hold its form or placed in a capsule. We have balms or salves, ingredients mixed with wax-like substances to make semi-solid paste, which are able to be smeared on the skin. In D&D, we have Cottonham's ointment, for example. If you're made with something sticky, it could form a resin or tar, such as what is used in a tanglefoot bag. The wax substance, mixed, could be honey, beeswax, or something similar. Incense, similar to powders but formed into blocks or attached to sticks to be burnt. Oils that be rubbed into the skin, including perfumes, things that are evaporated or burnt. Examples include the perfume of bewitching, oil of etherealness, and the oil of slipperiness. These are all applied to a person, where something like the alchemist fire is thrown. Lastly, you have poultices. These are often fresh herbs that are crushed and placed against the skin and held with a cloth. Now, do you need to backwards engineer every item to determine how it's made? No, of course not. Even if asked, a herbalist is unlikely to explain their process after all. Who would give away their trade secrets? But what you can do is use this to add depth. A herbalist is not just someone selling potions. They are someone who works and interacts with the world. A quest to get 10 blue orchids has a reason. The herbalist needs to crush them, steep them, and distill them into a potion. The herbalist has knowledge that the characters do not. Going back to our herbalist example, I mentioned that you had to walk past lavender to enter the shop. Perhaps this was just a nice touch, perhaps they're just a gardener, or perhaps the herbalist knows that lavender is a fantastic way to ward off evil spirits. It could be much more than just the person who sells potions. They harvest, they refine, and they combine. Let's go from talking about the methods to some examples of how they might manipulate and change the things they collect. They could make them stronger, or they could even change the effect completely. In a real-world example, the Australian explorers Burke and Wills attempted to eat a plant called nardoo after seeing Aboriginal people collecting it. The Yandruwana people collected, roasted, and washed this beanstalk-like sporocaps of the nardoo. Because Burke and Wills did not, they left an enzyme in the plant that broke down the B1 vitamins in their body, leading to nutritional deficiency and ultimately death. In a fantasy sense, the roasting and washing of this plant removed the poison, allowing the otherwise nutritious plant to be eaten. At the risk of turning into a herbalist in Dungeon spin-off, let's take some D&D plant monsters and herbalist our way into some useful concoctions. You could use these as quest items, with the herbalist offering payment for parts of the creature, or perhaps just to explain why the herbalist in town keeps buying these specific monster corpses. First off, I want to start with the Shrieker. This is a human-sized mushroom that shrieks to drive off predators. Shriekers are often described as being used by alarms for other creatures, particularly mind flayers. They themselves don't attack, but when close, they emit a loud sound. As the Game Master, you might decide that this sound either comes from vibrating or inflating a sac and pushing it through something like a larynx, making a high-pitched ree sound as the air is released. Let's go with the latter, in which case they've got this inflating and deflating section, which could potentially be dried, powdered, and turned into an item like the dust of dryness, where the powder greatly inflates when it comes in contact with water. Given that Shriekers are not particularly powerful creatures, and to preserve the fact that this is quite an expensive item, I would say that a dried and powdered Shrieker expanding sac would grant a single pinch, meaning a normal pack of dryness would require between 5 to 10 Shriekers. It's not that hard to gather, but noisy, time-consuming, and taking expert herbalist knowledge to turn it into something useful. The next creature we have is the Myconid. These humanoid mushroom people are generally friendly and communicate using spores. They have a special ability to use spores to not only communicate with other creatures, but affected creatures can communicate with each other. Straight away, you can see how these spores could be collected, brewed with other ingredients, and used to improve mental focus and make something like a potion of mind reading. The more powerful Myconid sovereign is an older monarch of a Myconid colony. They can use their spores for additional effects, such as raising the dead, creating hallucinations, and stunning creatures. All of these could be collected to create different items. These would likely be stored in different parts of the Myconid's body. Something like the spores that allow it to communicate probably need to be dispersed over a wide area, whereas the spores that raise dead probably would be focused and have a lower range, and thus smaller, and probably closer to the center of the stalk, or the Myconid body. So, if our herbalist got their hands on a Myconid sovereign body, what would they potentially do? Well, I can see the animating spores being collected, sealed in a container, probably with something to keep some moisture to keep the spores alive, or maybe the opposite, incredibly dry so they don't germinate. If they're dried, mixed with oil, and carefully applied to the recent corpse of a body, you might be able to animate it, creating a harmless zombie that can follow simple commands. The hallucination spores, these might be collected and used in rituals. In this case, perhaps mixed with incense and burnt. The item I would probably create from that one would be something like Mindwalk Incense. Something that can be burnt during a ritual and allowing players to roll religion checks to gain glimpses of the future. Mechanically, I might use this like the divination ability, giving them d20s that they can roll now, write down the number, and then replace with future rolls. Or I might just use it to grant them story information. The rapport spores allow the Myconid sovereign to target creatures with an intelligence greater of 2 that aren't undead, constructs, or elementals, and give them the ability to telepathically communicate with each other. This could be turned into a telepathy potion, allowing someone to communicate with other people within 30 feet. I'll probably describe this drink as having a warm, earthy, mushroomy taste. The next creature is the Vegepygmy. These are humanoid mole creatures born when russet malt kills a humanoid. There is another version of this, which is more bestial, which depends on the type of creature that was killed by the mold. Sticking with the Vegepygmy has 2 interesting traits that we can pull upon. The first is regeneration. It regains 5 hit points at the start of its turn, unless it's taken cold, fire, or necrotic damage. The next is spores. They can create a toxic 15-foot radius cloud that extends out from the Vegepygmy, doing poison damage and potentially poisoning a target. Fungal colonies tend to be made up of different types of fungus. So in this case, I'd probably say that the Vegepygmy is made up of different types of fungus all working together in order to coordinate and create something like a creature. Sections of the Vegepygmy skin could be carefully harvested and treated with something like vinegar to kill off some of the more aggressive types, but leave a cloth that kills bacteria and forms a protective barrier, perhaps even knitting itself together if provided with water and enough time. Such a cloth would need to be kept moist or risk drying out and dying. It would also be destroyed by even small amounts of cold, fire, or necrotic damage. Toxic spores could be dried into inhaled poisons or dissolved into weapons coatings. I tend not to like to give players stuff that causes the poisoned effect, just because it adds a whole bunch of extra work to me as the game master, trying to keep track of who's poisoned and who's not during a large combat. But I do like giving players things that just add poison damage. So these toxic spores, I'd say a player could dry these out, add them to some sort of oil, whether it just be lamp oil or some other oil that they've managed to collect, perhaps some sort of wax like beeswax, mix them together, and then apply them to bladed weapons, such as arrows, swords, and axes, and then just adding straight poison damage on top. The next creature we have is the Kelpie. Kelpie are horse-like seaweed creatures. They can use their action to change their form from a humanoid or beast that is small, large, or medium, and it uses this to set up ambush attacks, appearing to be just a mass of seaweed until it grabs a creature and then attempts to drown them. They have a drowning hypnosis attack where they can focus on a creature and it has to pass a wisdom saving throw or be charmed by the Kelpie. The effect of this charm is that the creature becomes incapacitated and if moved into water will breathe normally rather than holding their breath, basically allowing the Kelpie to drown them. So the Kelpie is a shape-shifting aquatic plant creature whose body resembles magically animated seaweed. So a couple of things. First of all, you can collect the seaweed. How might we use this? Well, I guess they're shape-shifting fibers. My first thought would be for some sort of camouflage equipment like cloaks. It's not really what a herbalist would use it for, but let's put that as one possible use. The next, perhaps they could be carefully cleaned and scraped. Oils could be collected and pressed out of the seaweed to create things that shimmer or change color, potentially for illusion-based cosmetics, salves, maybe even marvelous pigments. For anything that is aquatic and magical, I tend to like the idea that it's used for a potion of water breathing. So perhaps the core body, if you've ever seen seaweed, they tend to have a hard root in the center. Perhaps that could be collected, powdered, and turned into a potion of water breathing, perhaps mixed with other substances as well. So it's not just one thing that needs to be collected. Moving on to other magical plant creatures, we have the Shambling Mound. If you haven't seen one of these before, they are massive, vaguely humanoid plant creatures that have been animated when lightning strikes a particularly fertile bit of marsh or swamp. As a result, they have a lightning absorption feature. When they take lightning damage, it takes no damage and instead regains a number of hit points. This is a nice twist for people who haven't fought them before, encouraging your first Shambling Mound and the wizard accidentally heals it when they cast a lightning spell against it. The other thing they tend to do is move over bodies and absorb them into themselves. So a Shambling Mound might be walking around with some creatures poking out of it that are half decomposed. Couple of options of what we can do for this one. First, and the most obvious one, is that parts of it could be collected and turned into a potion of lightning resistance. The creature itself is magical and rejuvenates plants, so perhaps parts of it could be collected to use accelerate plant growth, particularly useful for races which are partial or all plants, such as treants. A herbalist may actually keep a small section of Shambling Mound, occasionally applying small electrical charges to it to keep it growing, and harvesting it for other key nutrients. It could be used to quickly break down bodies. So for example, a herbalist may have a small glass jar filled with a tiny section of Shambling Mound, occasionally giving it jolts of electricity to make sure it remains healthy, and dropping in dead creatures or discarded biological waste, and then turning that into a nutrient slurry that could be used for a fertilizer or perhaps as part of a basis for a more advanced healing potion. The next creature we have is a Woad. These are treant-like creatures that have been generally created through a ritual where a creature or spirit turns themselves into an eternal guardian of an area. Not something that good creatures would generally be killing, but you might just use it as a template. They regenerate 10 hit points at the start of their turn while they're in contact with the ground. If they take fire damage, this trait doesn't function. Their body is also made of their own weapons. So they have these club-like appendages and shields. So first thing is that if I was a druid character, this may be a great way to collect a new staff or a magical shield that can then be treated and improved. But if we stick with herbalism, there's two things. First is they have these roots that are able to absorb nutrients from the ground. Perhaps these root fragments could be collected, boiled, skinned, perhaps shredded and then treated. They could also be used to create protective charms, warding cells, something like that. If we assume they have some sort of central part of their body, like a heart, we could call it a heartwood, then that could be powdered and used for various potions. Probably be leading to something like a potion of heroism, giving a temporary boost to hit points. Possibly something that grants advantage or immunity to the frightened condition. The next creature we have is the corpse flower. Corpse flower has a couple of effects. The first is that it has the stench of death, where each creature that starts a turn within 10 feet of the corpse or one of its zombies must make a DC 14 con saving throw, unless they're a construct or undead. On a fail, they become incapacitated until the end of the turn. The next one is that they contain 1d6 plus 3 humanoid corpses and can hold up to a maximum of 9 dead humanoids. These remains have total cover against attacks and other effects while inside the corpse flower. If the corpse flower dies, the corpses within can be pulled free. It can do two things with these. First, it can digest one of the humanoids, instantly regrading 11 hit points. The corpse flower can also animate one dead humanoid, turning it into a zombie. The zombie appears in an unoccupied space within 5 feet of the corpse flower, acts as an ally, but isn't under its control. So if a herbalist got their hands on a corpse flower, one of the things I would suggest is they could turn or collect these animating, whether they be spores, whether or not they be some sort of nectar, collect it and turn it into something that can animate the dead. Now this would create a zombie that is not under control, but the herbalist may create another potion disguising themselves as the scent of the corpse flower. So you'd have two items that the herbalist would sell you. The first would be something like a perfume that you spray upon yourself to appear like a corpse flower. The next would be an item that you could pour or douse a corpse with that animates it. The corpse would animate, consider you an ally, and attack anything else around you. This might not be super useful for a party, given that only one of their players might be animating these undead creatures that don't attack anyone, but this would be a great item for a villain. You could even potentially throw off their plan by removing the potion from them, such as dousing them in water. Suddenly, a create water spell might be the way that the necromancer's plans come undone. You also have the stench production, which I talked about before. Given this is a flower, I'd say this is probably coming from pollen, which could be collected and then thrown. And then, of course, you have those digestive fluids. It's able to digest a full body in only a few seconds, meaning it would need to be either a very powerful acid or something that breaks down flesh. Perhaps this could be a very dangerous flesh-to-goo potion, which when used against a creature other than a construct, they take tremendous amounts of necrotic damage. I'm going to do a video soon on undead, but these are the sort of plants that I love for necromancers to have. I talked in an earlier episode about types of herons that are trained to collect fish and have collars so they can't swallow them. What if you had a corpse flower that was specifically grown in such a way that it was only able to digest smaller corpses or cut up corpses, but it could hold in its mouth corpses to keep them preserved? You might enter into a necromancer's lair, see dozens of corpse flowers all planted in neat rows, bulging with corpses, because they're the cheapest way the necromancer can keep their corpses fresh. The next creature we have is the assassin vine. As the name would suggest, it's an ambush predator. Usually stays put, but it can move. Looking at the stat block, it's a large plant that has a 5-foot movement, resistant to cold and fire, and immunity to lightning. This makes me think it might be related a little bit to a shambling mound. It slams creatures with its vines with a 10-foot reach, and the target becomes grappled. Once grappled, a creature can be constricted, doing slightly more damage. Assassin vines lurk within dense forests and swamps, but might encroach upon poorly tended fields and vineyards, waiting for an unsuspecting human or humanoid to walk close. The seeds can also be spread by birds, and they do have fruit, but is generally considered tough and bitter. So two things I want to focus on with this one. First is its fruit, and second are those grappling vines. Now, I mentioned before about harvesting Shambling Mound feeding it corpses in order to create a nutrient slurry. Here, we have a creature that spreads by seeds, which has very similar physiology to a shambling mound, and also loves to grapple creatures. So we could see a herbalist collecting this nutrient slurry, mixing it with a paste, carefully coating an assassin vine seed in something like wax, and then placing both in a small pouch. If done correctly, when thrown, the wax seal could be pierced, the nutrient slurry exposed to the seed, causing it to rapidly grow and explode outwards. You could either have a fully formed assassin vine suddenly appear, or you could have the vine spread out in every direction, grabbing and grappling things. This might be how a tanglefoot bag is made. The fruit itself could simply be collected, the seeds carefully removed, and the flesh consumed. And using the example before about the Australian explorers, perhaps such a fruit must be cooked before consuming or risk one of those little seeds germinating inside a person. So safe as long as it's cooked through. As with lots of plants, perhaps the roots may also have some sort of nutrient-rich effect. Any plant that is magically able to consume corpses and move around, I would say, is probably something that can be used to create potions of health. In this video, we've talked about all the different ways herbalists might process ingredients to get their desired effects. Potentially, they take an item, process it, and come out with something that has an opposite effect. For example, they may take a poisonous mushroom, dry it out, and make it something that's nutritious to eat. They also may greatly increase the effect of something by carefully concentrating it. Perhaps they powder it, place it into some water, boil that water, and then condense that liquid into something much stronger. We've also gone through a couple of D&D plant creatures and talked about how a herbalist may take those creatures and process them into something useful. And if you remember little else from this video, it's that herbalists harvest, refine, and combine. They harvest ingredients, they refine them into useful forms, and they combine them to increase their effect. I hope this video is giving you some inspiration into how you may build upon your herbalists and make them something more interesting for your players to interact with. This can also play upon just how they're experts in their own field. Perhaps next time your players run into a particularly difficult situation, they might think about that herbalist who seemed to know a lot about plants and how that might help them. Before I sign off, I want to go over that herbalism NPC I mentioned before. Icarus, Greenleaf. Greenleaf is a nice last name for a herbalist. Icarus could be shortened for Icky if your players get familiar enough. If he had an uptight personality, I might give him a love interest that calls him Icky for short. I already described the shop. A small squat building with vines along the outside and 2 large lavender bushes on either side of the door. At the back could be a small neat garden with various useful plants. Inside the shop, Greenleaf does most of the processing, occasionally using the drying boards outside. He specializes in extracting and distilling. He buys bloodgrass from several townsfolk and creates healing potions of various strengths. He also makes salves and tonics for the townsfolk, mostly for aches and pains, colds, and sprains. He is interested in a local flower called Fairy Bell. He's been able to extract its essence, which has been shown to grant sight into realms normally not perceived. Greenleaf is trying to perfect the process so he has a high success rate in making his potions of ethereal sight. Studious, inquisitive, and a hard worker, Greenleaf hopes to make his mark in herbalism. He is friendly, but clearly distracted by whatever new process or formula he is working on. So, thank you for listening to this episode of GMspiration, and most importantly, remember to have fun.